12:01 here, so we're going to get ahead and get started. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to our webinar today on the Clean Water State Revolving Fund funding process virtual workshop series. Documents needed to apply for SRF funding. My name is Maya Bani from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. And before we begin here, we're just going to go over a few housekeeping items and then we can get started. During the training today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar questions dialog box anytime throughout the session. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording and any other information you may need. You can also download the slides from today in the Handouts tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. This session has not been submitted for pre-approval of continuing education credits, but eligible attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for their personal record. To receive a certificate for the session, you must attend for the entire session and register and attend individually using your real name and unique email address. Certificates will be sent via email within 30 days of the webinar date. If you have any other questions or need assistance, please contact smallsystems@syr.edu. Now, just for a little bit about us, the Environmental Finance Center Network provides training and technical assistance to small water and wastewater systems in all U.S. states and territories through our building technical, managerial, and finance capacity programs. If your community or utility needs assistance with drinking water or wastewater system management, please feel free to contact us through our request form, which I'll be sharing shortly in the chat. And on that note, we can get started. I would like to introduce our presenters for today. Heather Himmelberger, Director, and Dawn Null, Project Director at the Southwest Environmental Finance Center.
Do you want to give us the share screen?
Yep, just 1 second.
Oh, do we do? All right, Dawn, do you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you. All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. My name is Dawn Null, and I'm here with Heather Himmelberger, and we'll be talking to you today about the CWSRF and the documents that you need to submit when you're applying for the CWSRF. Before we dig into that too far, we just want to give you a little bit of information about us and our team. Heather and I are with the Southwest Environmental Finance Center based out of the University of New Mexico. And on the screen, you can see our partners on this particular project, several of the other EFCs, and then Moonshot Missions and Mississippi State University have partnered with us on this particular project. We point that out because Moonshot Missions is offering some very in-depth technical assistance. If you have any questions about compliance, any concerns about compliance, or if your system seems like it's on the verge of reaching capacity for treatment, you're looking for solutions of how to pay for new project construction, Moonshot Missions could be really useful to you in answering some of those questions right now. And then also, we partnered with Mississippi State University to help with some of our decentralized and on-site wastewater systems. So if in your community you have some folks that happen to not be on the community system, but be on a local private system, like a septic tank or a lagoon, and they're having any questions or concerns, Mississippi State would be a great partner for them to reach out to. So we just wanted to highlight a couple of those things. Next slide, please, Heather. So we wanted to point out that this is a series every third Thursday of the month. We are highlighting a different aspect of the CWSRF program. And of course, we're in the August session right now. All of the previous sessions have been recorded. So next slide, thanks, Heather. So you can see, view any of the recordings on the EFC Network website. And when this one's complete, we will post the recording of it as well. So today, the items that we're going to be covering, we're going to do a quick review of the SRF program in case you haven't been able to attend some of the previous webinars. Then we'll get started on the basis of design. Heather will take over at what is a PER, with why you should be involved with the PER process, developing the RFP for the PER, and how do you fund that PER. And then I'll pick back up again and talk with you about the EID and what it is. And of course, we'll have some time at the end for question and answers. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we want to start with a quick review of the SRF, what it is and who it's for. So go ahead to the next slide for me, please. So we know that water and wastewater infrastructure is very expensive. It's too expensive for most utilities with only your user rates and revenue. So EPA has a construction grant program that was started in 1985. And this helped us, but it wasn't sustainable. We needed a way to continually fund new infrastructure projects. And that's where the CWSRF program comes into play. Next slide, please. So the Clean Water Act amendments of 1987 started the CWSRF program, and it's evolved since then. Next slide, please. So there are currently 51 CWSRF programs, and they function like an environmental infrastructure bank. They provide low interest loans to eligible recipients for water and wastewater, for this one, for wastewater infrastructure projects. And the money grows in the fund over time. And there are low interest rates due to grants that each state or territory gets from the federal government. And we just recently, in the last few weeks, put out an animation on how the SRF programs work. So if you've got folks that are a bit uncertain or have some questions about how that funding gets from EPA to the state, to the utility, how the utility repays it, it's a great little animation. And again, it is on the EFCN website. So we just wanted to highlight that animation since it is brand new and we are talking about the SRF programs today. Next slide, please. So there are 51 programs, one for each state, plus Puerto Rico. Next slide. How each state spends the money is really up to each state. So they decide exactly how to divvy up the money that they get from the federal government through the SRF program. But the key is to understand the SRF program. The key in understanding that program is understanding that there are a few aspects that hold true for all states. And so we wanted to point out that states do have flexibility to make decisions. So they can target different types of projects, different types of infrastructure. They can customize their loans. There's some new money for emerging contaminants and for on the drinking water side, the lead service lines. So there are areas that vary from state to state. So you need to talk to folks in your state about your SRF program to understand the details for them. But what we will talk about today, we want to try and cover as broadly as possible. So it doesn't matter what state you're in, it should be applicable to you. But we do want to point out, and we will probably say more than once, that this varies from state to state, because each state is allowed to make their own decisions.
All right, well, thanks, Dawn. And I'm going to pick it up for a little while and then we'll have Dawn come back. So we're going to talk about what documentation is needed for the state revolving fund to get the money. So there's always sort of a little semantics of what the application actually means. So is the application just the piece of paper where you write what you need, or is it the broader collection of documents? So we're talking today about sort of that broader collection of documents you need in order to receive money from the State Revolving Loan Fund. And as Dawn said, every state is unique. Every program is going to be a little bit different. So they all follow the same basic guidelines, but they're all going to have their own individual nuances on how they do things. And it's going to be, again, the flexibility is built in on purpose, so a state can modify things to really meet their own needs and meet the needs of the communities that they serve. So one of the things that you need is really the basis of design. So what is the reason that you're doing this project? How is this project going to be done? What is it going to include? And so there needs to be some basis for what that is, because the state won't know what to fund if they don't understand what it is you're doing. So the most common document for this basis of design is the preliminary engineering report. So that's the report that is typically written by an engineer, and it describes what the project is going to be, a little bit about, at least where it's assumed to be located. Sometimes in detailed design that might change a bit, but in general, it's going to describe the project, how it's going to be done, what it's going to cost, that type of thing. And then another document needed is an environmental information document, and Dawn will get into more details about sometimes you have to do more than the environmental information document, go deeper into environmental and go deeper into that environmental documentation process. But typically, these are going to be the most common documents you're going to have to do. Some states are also going to require an asset management plan or a fiscal sustainability plan. And that varies a bit by state, exactly what your requirements are under that. And then there may be other documents that states need, but everybody is going to require some kind of basis of design. So if it's not a preliminary engineering report, maybe it's a facility plan or something like that, it's going to be very similar to a preliminary engineering report. And this is really needed to get to that readiness to proceed step. So they need to know you've thought about your project, you know what you want to do, you have an idea of what that's going to be, what it's going to cost, what it's going to take to operate, etc. Because they want to know that before they give you the money, they want to know what you're going to use it for. So on the screen now is just an example of 3 different states and the types of documents that you would have to do. So Tennessee, for example, is the most documents on this particular list. I mean, there could be other states that have more documents. We're only picking out 3 just to show you kind of just an idea of different states. So, audited financial statements or user rate ordinance, environmental review, etc. So we're showing you how, again, it is very different from state to state, but all states are going to need some environmental and some type of engineering report to get started. So because of that, we're going to focus on the 2 similarities, the PER and the environmental documents, and not get into all the other documentation, and especially because these are the 2 big documents that are going to define your project and really lead you through the process of what you're going to do. So again, there's possibly other documentation that you're going to need besides these, but the focus today will really be on the PER and the environmental documentation. So what is a PER? And again, that acronym means Preliminary Engineering Report, and just understand that some states might call it something different. It highly likely looks very, very similar. Even if they're calling it something different, it's going to look very similar to what we're going to talk about. So here's a couple of definitions from different states to kind of get their idea of what a PER means to them. So for Nevada, a planning document used to find the best construction project to remedy a public health, safety, or environmental concern. From Indiana, a document that provides the information necessary for the SRF program to determine the technical, economic, and environmental adequacy of the proposed project. And finally, the last quote, a PER evaluates the condition, capacity, and function of a water, sewer, storm, or irrigation facility. In all 3 of these definitions, you get the idea that it's basically a communication tool so that you can communicate to the funding entity what it is you're trying to do. So what exactly is your project going to entail? What does it look like? Is it pipes? Is it treatment facilities? Is it combination of that? Does it include pump stations? You know, you need to give them an idea of the scope and magnitude of the project, so that PER is going to help them understand what you're doing, how much it's going to cost, what it's all going to include, and that type of thing. So who's going to prepare your PER? A professional engineer licensed in your state is the most likely route that you're going to go. I don't know if any states don't require that, but we'll leave the possibility that there may be a state that doesn't. But typically it has to be a professional engineer that's licensed in your state. And it does matter. Say I happen to be a professional engineer. I'm licensed in 2 states. I'm licensed in New Mexico and Pennsylvania. So it would not be appropriate for me to do a project like this where I'm going to stamp something if I was doing it in Texas, say, or if I was doing it in Indiana or Tennessee. So you really have to make sure that that professional engineer who's in charge of your project is licensed in your state, so they have the appropriate credentials. And then it will have to be stamped by that engineer, which means that that engineer was in responsible charge and stands by that report. And the final thing on this slide, which I think is probably the most important item, is the wastewater utility should be involved in the development of the PER. So what you don't want to have happen is for you to go hire an engineer to do this, and they kind of go away and do their thing, and they come back to you when it's about, you know, 70% done, and they say, okay, well, here it is. Do you have any comments? You really want to be involved through the whole thing so that they understand what it is you're trying to accomplish, what alternatives would be appropriate, that kind of thing. So we're going to talk more about this involvement, but I want to plant the seed now because it's really, really important that you stay involved in the development of the PER. So even though you're not writing it, you're not going to be putting sections, you need to be engaged with whoever you hire to do it, to make sure that it's a team effort and it's not just them sort of doing their thing without your involvement. So what's included in the PER? It will depend a bit on the state and the type of project you're doing. So it might be more complicated if you're doing a very complicated project. Like let's say you're building a brand new treatment plant somewhere and you have to put in piping and a pump station and you have to put in a treatment plant. You know, that could be a very complicated PER. In other cases, you might be doing just a small project where you're replacing some pipeline, and maybe that's a more simple PER. So it kind of just depends a bit on what kind of project you're doing. We wanted to focus on the specific need at hand. So what is going on? Is the treatment plant overloaded? Is the sewer system not functioning properly? Is the pump station past its useful life and causing lots of issues? So it should focus on that specific need for your community. And it should include alternative solutions with cost comparisons and how they impact operation and maintenance and how they might impact the rates that you charge. So whenever you're trying to do something, it's often the case that there are more than one way to do that thing. So if you're trying to do treatment, for example, there may be more than one way that you can provide that treatment. So maybe there's a package plant, maybe there's a lagoon system, maybe there's different types of treatment that require more or less operation and maintenance. So whatever you're doing, there can be more than one way to do it, and you want to know what those alternative solutions are, and you want to know the cost comparisons, because if it's going to cost your customers a lot more money, you know, maybe you want to go with a different option. And you also want to know how it's going to impact during construction and operation. How will it impact that community? And how will it impact the environment? So do you have very stringent requirements on nutrient removal, which is getting more common these days because we've had algal blooms in lakes, for example, where that's caused, you know, toxic chemicals to be put in the water, like in Toledo, where that became a big problem because there was a lot of nutrients in the water, caused an algal bloom. Now the water treatment plant is pulling in that water, and it's toxic and people can't drink it. So we want to think about what are these different needs to try to protect the community and the environment. There is some multi-agency best practice guides that have been done between USDA, US EPA, HUD, and IHS. So the US Department of Agriculture funds water and wastewater projects as well under the Rural Development Group. And then of course US EPA is the group that has the state revolving funds, you know, that money to give into states. And then HUD is Housing and Urban Development, and they do a little bit of funding, a little bit more in maybe the individual homes and trying to get them connected up. And then Indian Health Service, if there's a tribal community or you're connected with tribal residents, there can be funding there. And so what happened is each of these agencies kind of had its own preliminary engineering report practices, and they didn't necessarily 100% coincide. So that becomes problematic if you're applying for the state revolving fund and you've used that approach, and then you want to take it to RD and get some more money for maybe a part of the project, or you just decide to fund it 2 different ways, or you need more money. You didn't want to be in a situation where the PER wouldn't work for multiple agencies. So the agencies kind of got together and said, well, maybe if we could come up with some best practices that could work for all of us, that would make it easier for the community. So the outline includes things like planning, the project planning, describing your existing facilities, what the need for the project is. And that's not to be underestimated, the need for the project. When you're doing a project, you should be very well versed in why you need to do that project. Everybody in your team should understand what the reason for the project is. And if you can't articulate it well, then you might want to rethink what you're doing, because it should be very clear cut. We are doing this project because, let's say, the infiltration inflow is so high that it's causing our treatment plant to not function properly, or the pump station has had multiple failures and we've overflowed sewage onto the ground, and that's not healthy. So you want to really be thinking through, why do you want to do this project? And then alternatives, which we talked a bit about before, you know, what alternatives did you consider in the documentation? And this should not just be a very cursory 1-sentence write-up of all the alternatives. It should be much more than that. It should be much more in depth of the different alternatives, so you truly can make a decision of what alternative makes the most sense. And then we want to know in the next bullet, what is that selected alternative? So if you had 5 options, which option did you pick and why? You know, why was that alternative selected over others? And getting back to what I mentioned before, being involved, when that alternative is selected, the community really, really needs to be involved so that you know why it was chosen, it, you know, meets your criteria, et cetera. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Talking through the proposed project with costs and all of that. And then finally, conclusions and recommendations. So as you're moving forward with your project, you're going to go to detailed design. And that can be, if there's any recommendations for that process, that can be included there. So again, if you use an approach that works for multiple agencies, it does protect your ability to apply to different funders without paying for changes to the PER. So in the past, what often happened is you started out with one funding source, and for some reason you decided to go to a different one. You've already done your PER, and all of a sudden you have to pay somebody to make additions or changes, and that just isn't good for anybody. Or you might really think, I am absolutely going with rural development, and then you get into the process and all of a sudden you figure out that the SRF has better terms and you want to go that way. You don't want to have to start over and pay a firm to do another PER changes. You want to be able to keep the one you have and go forward. So the more you can try to create a PER that fits all the funding agencies in your state, the better off you are. And then at the state level, there are states like New Mexico, for example, that has come up with a PER process within the state level and said, okay, all the funders have agreed if you do a PER this way, they can accept it. So you might end up doing a bit more than you would have to do for an individual funding source, but it'll protect your ability to go to another funding source. And here's, we're going to show you just a couple of example outlines. They look very similar, but here is the state of New York. So it looks a lot like the one that we showed for the multi-agency. And here's an example from Indiana, again, looking very similar. And we wanted to mention this. We're not going to go into great detail about permitting because permitting is very specific to the state and type of project you're doing. But it's really important to understand that permitting is highly likely to be a part of this whole process. You need to understand what permits you're going to have. And you're probably going to want to include this in the RFP for whoever you get, or the request for proposals is what an RFP is. So whoever you get to do the preliminary engineering report for you, you want them to look at the permits and tell you what kind of permits you're going to need to be able to do your project. And you may need permits from the Army Corps, the environmental agencies, other federal or state authorities. So you really want somebody to look into that for you, like what kind of permits will you need, and you want to be aware of all of them before you start your project, because that could have an impact on the design or the alternatives chosen. And if you have any kind of direct discharge to the waters of the United States, you're going to have an NPDES permit. And if that needs to be updated, you also have to include that. So going back to what I mentioned before, the involvement in the PER development, why do we want you to stay involved? And again, this is a big theme for the PER, is why do we want you to stay involved? It may be so much easier to just, okay, we're hiring somebody, just go do your thing and tell us when you're done. The biggest thing to remember is whatever is built is going to be your responsibility from that point on. So the engineer is not going to be there to operate your system. So you're going to have something designed, and they're going to construct it using the money from the state revolving fund or some other source. They're going to turn over the keys to you after startup, and then from then on, you have to operate that system. So whatever they give you is going to be your responsibility, and you don't want to be out of the loop on choosing what that is, and you don't want to be regretting later what choice they made. So you really do want to be involved and make sure that you're clear on why they've chosen what they've chosen and that is the choice that you want. Another reason is that you know the system better than anyone. So the engineer that you hire is not going to be an expert in your facility. They're going to be an expert in engineering in general, but not necessarily your facility. So they're going to need information about your system. They're going to need to know things about the existing facility, maybe some past maps or record drawings that you have. They're going to need some information about wastewater flow rates, user rates. So they're going to need technical, managerial, and financial information as they're doing their project, and they can't do it without that information. So they're going to have to work with you to get it, and the more cooperative you are with each other, the easier and faster the PER will go. And they're also going to want to know, what are your goals for the project? You know, what kind of capabilities does your operations team have? Are you a highly mechanized automated system or not? You know, could you be a mechanized automated system, or would that not work well for your community? So just trying to keep, again, that understanding between you and the engineer, because the engineer most likely is not from your community, has not spent a lot of time at your facility, so you're going to need to share all that information with them. And again, we've talked about this already, but I want to come back to it, is in considering the alternatives, this is a huge, huge part of the PER. It's one of the biggest parts, is just looking at the different ways that things can be done. And at one point in the past, I did a lot of reviews of documentation for the drinking water SRF here in New Mexico, and looking at alternatives evaluations, and you could see cases where the community probably was not involved very highly, and where the alternatives evaluation process wasn't done very well. And I've seen many PERs for different places. And you really want to make sure, as you're looking for those alternatives, that the community goals are included and considered, that you're going to be in compliance with any of those regulatory rules, environmental laws, codes that we talked about, with permitting and so forth. Like the project has to know what are those and will the project meet them. It needs to be affordable for that community. So whatever is given, the community's gonna have to pay for it from then on. And even if you've got a grant for construction, that doesn't take care of your operation and maintenance costs, which can be considerable. So we want to make sure that the community will be able to pay the user rate, be easier to operate and maintain, be long lasting, and then fit the utility and the community culture. So again, thinking about, mechanization and automation and various things, what works well for your community. So again, going back to that idea that it is your facility after you're done, it's your facility. So we really do need to consider how this is going to impact your community going forward. And just a couple of examples, these are real world examples that have happened. So one community, rather than a gravity sewer, the alternative chosen by the engineer was a grinder pump system where the pipes can be more shallow buried, but every house has to have a grinder pump. And this system has given the community a lot of trouble. They didn't fully understand what they were taking on. They didn't understand the cost of these grinder pumps. They've had to replace many of them, and that's, on the dime of the wastewater department. It's caused problems within the treatment plant itself because the sewage sits too long in the grinder pump sump tanks. So it's been a huge issue, and they wish that they had chosen the gravity sewer instead of the grinder pump system. And they weren't involved enough in all the implications of that choice. And so that's what ended up, putting them in this situation. So again, thinking through all the ramifications of choosing to go this way instead of a gravity system, would have been important for them. In another case, a community is choosing a complex treatment, concrete and steel plant over a lagoon system. And there can be some advantages to having, a complicated treatment system, but it will require a lot more operation and maintenance. So when you go from a lagoon, which is a much simpler operation, to a complicated treatment plant, it can greatly increase the operation and maintenance costs. And that needs to be considered before you really go forward and decide, is this really what you want to do? Because it will cost you a lot more money. So generally speaking, you're going to want to hire an engineer to prepare this PER, as we mentioned before. And to select that engineer, you should prepare a request for proposals, or a request for qualifications. Sometimes we call them RFQs, RFP. The idea is that you're going to put a document out there that people can bid on and you can choose. So that process, we're going to term it the RFP today. But again, sometimes it's called the RFQ, the request for qualifications. You definitely want to plan ahead. You want your description to be as detailed as possible of exactly what you want the engineer to do for you. So the engineer is going to price the project. Eventually, we're going to talk about pricing in a minute, but they're going to charge you an amount based on what it is you want done, and they're only going to do what you describe. So if you have a lot of things in mind but you don't put them down, you're not going to get them without paying more money. So you need to be very clear about what it is you want the engineer to do. You want to identify how they can ask questions about the proposal. That process has to be handled very carefully so that you're not unfairly advantaging one firm over another. So typically it's submitting questions to a single person, and then all the answers and all the questions are put out to everybody so that you don't advantage one group over another. If you want to have a site visit, which could be a really good idea depending on what the project is, identify a date that people can come and tour your facility with you. Identify the deadline for submission and any kind of requirements you have. Do you want paper copies, electronic, how many? What selection criteria you're going to use. And you really want to think that out, like what is the most important component for you? Is the qualification the most? Is knowing, small communities the most? Like what kinds of things do you want to give the most points to? And then lastly, since we've been talking about how you should be involved in the process, describe how you want the engineer to involve you. So how and when in the process? So will they meet with you monthly? Will they meet with you bi-weekly? Will they meet with you at certain points in the process? You know, how is that going to go? That's important, because if they have to come to your facility, that's going to cost them money. They need to be thinking about that, you know, in the eventual case when they put a price to this. The scope of work, things like, you know, who does the project impact? What should the PER address? Is this one project? So this is kind of that process of describing the project to them. So how many people and households are being served? How do we want the alternative analysis to go? So this is kind of thinking about what it is the engineer is going to do for you. And then when we get to the evaluation criteria, we want to standardize the scoring as much as possible and remove subjectivity. So you want it to be as objective as you can. There's no way for it to be 100% objective, because anytime you're doing something like this, different people are going to read different things into it. But you want to have multiple people scoring the project so that you can remove some of that subjectivity that way as well, so that if you have, say, 3 to 5 reviewers, you can talk about why each person gave it a certain score, and that can help remove some of the subjectivity, because the idea is to try to be as objective as possible. And if you can set clear evaluation criteria, that gives the people who are applying for your project an idea of what to put in it. It's more fair, it ensures high quality responses, and you know, thinking about your high priority factors, those are the things you can give the most points to. Minor considerations should have the least. And you should really be thinking about technical expertise, capabilities, you know, data security, all of those types of things that are important to you. So here's just one example of what, you know, criteria with, you know, is being suggested here. So this is just a source, an online source, to just talk about, you know, what kinds of criteria. And here's another one. This is from the qualification-based selection guide. This is a little bit more complicated one where you can give weights to the different factors, and you can give ratings from 1 to 5, and then come up with a total, and each reviewer can do that. So what wasn't included on those past 2 evaluation process slides? Well, the big thing is cost and price. So generally, when we're looking for engineers to do designs or even preliminary engineering reports, when we're looking for professional services, they're often selected using what's called a qualification-based selection process, or QBS. And in a QBS process, the firm is selected first based on their experience and expertise, and then the price is negotiated after. If you can't agree to a price with the first firm, then often you can go to number 2 in the rankings and negotiate with them. But you're looking more at the qualifications of the firm, because we don't typically like to hire engineers based on low bid. So if we're doing construction, that is often low bid. So we're kind of implying that all these construction firms are doing the same thing, so the cheapest one is who we want. In engineering, it's very different from one engineering firm to another. So the process that was set up was this qualification-based selection process, so that you're using that rather than low bid. You do want to check with your state to determine your specific qualification-based selection requirements, and it should not be that hard to find out what that is. The SRF agencies or many others could help you, or if you need help, you know, reach out to us. But you can get their specific requirements and make sure you follow those. You can also often get RFP templates from various agencies where they'll say, here, this is what an RFP could look like. So the problem is, it's great to have those types of things, but you want to be careful not to just use them lock, stock, and barrel, because it may or may not really have all the things that you need. So you really want to be careful about just using exactly what they give you, but rather use it as a starting place and modify, like in some of the ways that we have on the screen there, modify it to fit your needs. You're going to want to interview the firms before you choose one. So what you'll do is take the long list of firms, down select using the criteria, and then interview the firms on the short list. And make sure that you have criteria ahead of time for what questions you're going to ask them and how much time. Make sure that everybody gets exactly the same amount of time, everybody gets the same basic questions, so that, you know, there's a fair process. And then ask for references, and, you know, have them be similar to your type and size of project, and contact them. See how the project worked before you choose your engineer. And then when you're all done with like interviews, references, you're going to select the engineer that you think best fits your project. So there is some funding for PER development. There can be funding through the state revolving fund programs, through their set-asides. The community development block grant in some states has that kind of funding, and some states have their own state funded sources of money. So there are various states that there's pots of money that you can use for this purpose that are not federal in nature. And then there are some federal programs, like USDA has some programs that will fund PERs. So if you're trying to get your planning process going, sometimes you can use other funding sources to do that for you. And here's just an example of Montana, so that there are several planning grant programs in Montana that you can use, and other states have similar things. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dawn. So go ahead, Dawn, take it away.
All right, Maya, if you can make me the presenter, please. Do I need to switch the screens around?
Yes, it looks like we have the 2 slides.
All right. Thank you very much. All right, so we are going to shift gears from talking about the PER that Heather covered, and we're going to start talking about the other document that's required in almost every state. And sometimes it has a bit different name, but EID, the Environmental Information Document, is what most states are calling it now. So what is the EID? And what do you need, and how do you go about it? So similarly to what we showed you with the PER, different states have different definitions of what the EID is. So we've just, you know, put 3 examples up here so you can see that from state to state there are differences, but there are similarities. And so the point of the EID is really, you know, how Georgia words it, a concise document that adequately discusses the environmental impact of the proposed project. So we're looking here for what's the impact of the project on the environment. And then with Vermont, the level of detail and the amount of information provided in this environmental report is commensurate with the magnitude of construction activities and their potential impact on environmental and historical resources. So again, we're looking at the impact on the environment and the historical resources for Vermont. And I picked Vermont's because I did like the fact that they say that it's commensurate with the magnitude of construction. For most states, that's true. The size of the project, how much land you're disturbing, those kinds of things are what they want you to tell them. And then with Texas allows, and this one was for the water side, but similar, allows the Water Supply and Infrastructure Division, as well as other review agencies, to make determinations about the degree of impacts that can reasonably be expected to occur as a result of construction of a proposed project. So again, you know, it's slightly different wording, but giving you the same kind of message. And so when we start looking at the EID is going to be developed to let the funders know what the impact to the environment will be. So you want to tell them about what the project, where the project's going to be located and what the project's going to disturb. And then the state will review that document and they will come up with a determination. And those determinations are shown on the right of the screen. And these may vary slightly from state to state. Sometimes you'll see 3, sometimes you'll see 4. Oftentimes the bottom 2 are combined into 1. But every state will make some type of a determination to see what direction you have to go once you submit your EID. And so the first one in this category is the FONSI, the finding of no significant impact. So if you submit your EID and you get a FONSI, you may have to submit some environmental documentation that would be pretty limited in scope. And then you may have a review, but the point here is that they're not finding any significant impact. So there's probably not too many next steps. The next category can be similar to a FONSI and sometimes used somewhat interchangeably within the states, but a categorical exclusion. And these can, the types of exclusions that they have, we have a few examples listed here where, you know, you have a project that's entirely in previously disturbed land, or you're only replacing assets with new assets. So you're digging up the trench that's already been dug up before, or maybe you're just disturbing a very small portion of land, to add a small building onto an existing site. So those could be categorical exclusions, and like I said, they can vary a lot from state to state. A categorical exclusion may require you to do some type of a public comment process. So some states will require more than a CADEX, even if there's no new disturbance. So it really depends on the project and how much land you're disturbing and where you're disturbing that land and if it's been disturbed previously or not. So as you submit this paperwork, we want you to be aware that there are these different types of outcomes. And then the third is the most stringent, and almost every state will say that these are rare or have never happened. But they do exist, and there is a possibility. And sometimes if you're doing brand new construction and it's close to a protected site, or there may be some type of historical human remains or something of that nature, then you would get into this much more stringent review that would require further environmental assessment, or maybe even into the record of decision or the environmental impact statement. So these are kind of the most stringent types of requirements or decisions where they say, it looks like you guys are really going to be working in an area that we're concerned about. So we want you to go further and do a full environmental assessment or a full environmental impact statement. But as we mentioned here, those can be expensive, they can be time consuming and having troubles with my letters today. And so oftentimes, we're working in areas that we've worked before. And so we're not going to get to this level of necessity, but be aware of them so that you can plan appropriately. If you're looking at a new site, you think, oh man, it'd be really great if we could build a new wastewater treatment plant in this area that we just accessed and or acquired, now it's in the county limits and we could potentially build there. And if nothing's been built there before and we're not sure what's underground, it could be an issue. So if you are developing an EID for submitting your application for the SRF, again, you will probably want to have an RFP, so a request for proposals. So what do you include in the RFP for the environmental document? Well, this one's a little bit different and could be a little bit tricky because sometimes the EID is part of the PER requirements, so you may not need a separate RFP at all. But sometimes it is a separate document and there can even be separate funding for it. So you may need a separate RFP. If you need a separate RFP, it's going to look somewhat similar to the requirements for the PER and how you go about developing that RFP. But of course, the language is going to be different because you're looking for someone to do an environmental assessment, or that's not the right word, but an environmental determination or documentation of what's there and where you're going to be building. So make sure that when you're developing that RFP, you kind of go through those same steps that you went through for your PER, but that you take into consideration also the language regarding state requirements. So sometimes there are things like the state must have the legal authority to conduct environmental reviews. That has to be in the RFP. Or if there are requirements for public notice or public hearings, make sure that that is included in the language for your RFP. And of course, you still want to have some alternatives analysis of how the project will avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse impacts. And oftentimes you may have mapping requirements for an EID that you wouldn't have necessarily for a PER. So just be aware that while they're similar, there can be some differences. And so when you're developing that RFP, it'll be a similar process. But again, you want to put thought into it. You want to plan ahead. You want to think about what it is you're trying to get to communicate to the state, to show them that you could build here, you could do some construction here without disturbing the environment. The next thing that we want to provide to you is just the fact that there is a website. The EPA has a website that they keep up to date that has one point of contact for each state for the CWSRF. And that website looks like this. And of course, you just keep scrolling down if your state is alphabetically after Georgia. But this is what the page looks like. So you can get emails, phone numbers, you can get direct links to their website. And when I pulled this screenshot, it said that the website had been updated the day before. So they do keep it as current as possible. And then we have other resources I'm going to point out as well for how you can go about contacting folks at the SRF programs. But this is a good, easy, straightforward way to get contact information. Switching gears again a little bit, we wanted to let you all know that we do have the ability to provide technical assistance. I think the request form is in the chat. And we can do technical assistance remote or in person. Most of the technical assistance we do is primarily remote, but if in person is better, we can make that work. And we can provide this technical assistance. So what that means is we can work with you one-on-one to help solve a problem or prepare for applying for funding. And we can provide this assistance on a wide variety of topics, technical, managerial, financial. We've got a list on the screen of topics, but it's broader than this. Pretty much anything that you would have concerns or questions about on your wastewater operations, management, financial situation, we can work with you at no cost to help assist you with the experts on our team. And to request that assistance, like I said, I think the link's in the chat, but also if you go to the EFC Network website, at the top of the screen on every page you go to is that big blue button that says Get Help. We have the nice bright red arrow pointing to it. And when you click on it, you will be asked to fill out a technical assistance request form. And really all we're asking you to do here is give us your name and a way to contact you so that we can follow up with you. And if you can give us a bit of detail of what your concerns are, that's helpful for us to get started to figure out who to have contact you that would have the most expertise in the area that you're requesting assistance for. So it's a great no cost resource for you. So we want to make sure you're aware of it. And again, today's webinar is part of a series, and today's webinar will be posted. And when it's posted, it will be posted on the page with all of the other recordings. So when you go to the EFC Network website, you go to the trainings and events tab that we have circled up here, and then you can pick which recording you want to view. And the slides are also available for download. Today's slides are also available through the GoToWebinar toolbar should be on the right side of your screen or the top of your screen, I believe. So those are also available. And I wanted to mention that I said when I had the slide up, I'll just go back real quick to that one, that the CWSRF program contacts are on EPA's website. The EFC, the Southwest EFC has a SRF switchboard, which provides you information on things like intended use plans and other information that how to access them. So sometimes the websites maybe are more user-friendly than others. So we want to get you directly to the types of documents that you're looking for. So through the Southwest EFC website, we do have that SRF switchboard. So just wanted to let you know that if you're looking for more than just a contact name, we do have that available. So I think we are good on time. We have time for some questions. So if you have any questions, make sure you're typing them into the questions box in the go-to format. And in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and put up our contact information. So my name and email are at the top. Heather's is in the middle there under the Southwest EFC. And then this is our Southwest EFC website and our Southwest EFC phone number. The entire network as a whole, which is where most of the resources that we talked about today can be found, are here at efcnetwork.org. We've also listed a couple of other contacts. They are part of this webinar series and have presented some of the other webinars. So Christy at UNC and Tanya at Wichita State are also available for questions about the SRF or funding in general, or pretty much any of those other topics that we put up earlier talking about TA. So with that, I will stop talking and see if we have any questions that have come in.
So far, it looks like we only have one, and I think it pertains to what Heather covered. The question asks, if a tribal utility is under the primacy of the EPA and is putting in an application under the tribal set-aside, where would the engineer preparing the PER need to be licensed?
It's still in the state where the tribe is located. So for example, if you're located, like I'll pick a tribe here in New Mexico, if you're say San Felipe Pueblo here in New Mexico, you would want an engineer that is licensed in New Mexico. So I know that it's a little bit different because the tribe is sort of an equivalent to a state, but what we would want is to have an engineer who's licensed in that state where the tribe is located, because part of the reason for that is that they're more familiar with the state, the rest of the area around, like they're going to be familiar with the climate, they're familiar with the soils, they're familiar with all of that type of thing. So if you were a tribe, say located in Indiana, and you picked an engineer from New Mexico, thinking, well, because it's tribe, it doesn't matter. Like they're not going to understand the environment of Indiana as well as an engineer from Indiana or who is licensed in Indiana and has worked there. So you'd still want to pick a licensed engineer from the state where you're located, even if you are a tribe. It's best to have an engineer from that state do your project. And Dawn, I don't know if you had anything to add, but that would be my answer.
I agree.
At the moment, I don't see any other questions popping into the chat.
Well, then we'll just thank everybody for being on today. We appreciate your participation. Thank you all for being here, and we look forward to seeing as many as possible that are able to come to the next webinar on the 3rd Thursday of September.
All right, and thank you as well, Heather and Dawn, for sharing your expertise with us today. Following this webinar, you all will receive a follow-up email with the slides from today and a link to the recording. We also ask that you complete the webinar evaluation following this webinar so you can let us know your thoughts on today's session, as this helps us plan future webinars on the topics important to you. Thank you all again, and we hope to see you at future EFCN events.